The rain came down in sheets as if the sky itself wept for the bond they shared, a bond forged through years of unwavering loyalty. Officer Daniel Ross knelt beside his partner, a German shepherd named Shadow, stroking the dog's sleek fur as they waited in the stillness of the early morning. Shadow's dark eyes, full of wisdom and sorrow, met his with a quiet understanding. No words were needed. They had been through hell together. From the nights when the world felt too heavy to bear, to the moments of fleeting peace when the city was silent and the only sound was Shadow's steady breathing. But tonight was different. Tonight, they faced the darkness of a cruel world, a world that would soon test their bond in ways neither of them could have prepared for. In the blink of an eye, everything would change. One moment of violence, and the dog that had saved Daniel's life a dozen times would lie broken at his feet, a victim of merciless bikers. And Daniel? He would show no mercy. Not for them. Not when they had hurt his family. The rain fell steadily, soaking through the thick fog that covered the small, sleepy town. The streets were quiet, save for the distant growl of engines that seemed to reverberate through the cold air. In the dim light of the pre-dawn hours, Officer Daniel Ross leaned against his squad car, his fingers brushing the worn leather collar of the German shepherd at his side. "Ready, boy?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Shadow, his loyal partner for 5 years, gave a soft bark in response. His golden brown eyes, always filled with silent understanding, glimmered in the low light. The dog's gaze met Daniel's, steady and unwavering, as if the two of them were already united in purpose. The bond they shared was one that went beyond words. Shadow wasn't just a working dog, he was family. After losing his wife in a tragic accident, Daniel had retreated into himself, until the day he'd met Shadow at the K-9 unit training camp. From that moment, they'd been inseparable, fighting side by side in a world that had become too painful to navigate alone. Tonight the world felt heavy. The kind of stillness that came right before chaos. The biker gang known as the Reapers had made their home in an old rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. They were notorious for their violent robberies, drug trafficking, and cruelty. They didn't care about the laws or the people they hurt. They took what they wanted, and if anyone stood in their way, they left destruction in their wake. But what made the Reapers particularly dangerous was their habit of targeting the vulnerable, the elderly, the helpless, anyone who couldn't defend themselves. People who had no one to turn to for help. That was where Daniel and Shadow came in. Tonight, they were the last line of defense. "Stay close," Daniel muttered, his voice low as he tapped his flashlight against his leg. He was used to this, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the focus that sharpened his senses. He had trained for moments like this, but even so, there was a gnawing unease deep inside. His hand brushed against Shadow's fur, and for a brief moment, the weight of everything that had brought them here settled in. Shadow stood tall and still beside him, his dark eyes scanning the shadows, ears perked, body coiled like a spring. The dog was alert as ever, completely in tune with Daniel's every move. Shadow knew the drill better than anyone. The two of them had faced danger before, in situations where others might have hesitated. But they were a team, one unit, united by a bond forged in fire. They had learned to read each other's cues without speaking. Daniel trusted Shadow with his life. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the thick mist that clung to the ground. The faint hum of motorcycle engines buzzed from within, and the low murmur of voices echoed in the distance. It was a familiar sound, the sound of danger, of violence about to unfold. The kind of thing Daniel had seen too many times in his years on the force. Shadow's body tensed beside him as they approached the entrance, his muscles taut, his eyes narrowed. He was ready. But Daniel's heart rate spiked. He knew the gang's reputation. They weren't afraid to fight back, and they wouldn't hesitate to make an example of anyone who stood in their way. But there was no turning back now. Daniel placed a hand on Shadow's back, giving him a soft, reassuring pat. "Let's do this." Shadow gave a low growl in response, a sound so subtle yet filled with quiet menace. The dog knew exactly what was at stake just as Daniel did. And together they were ready to face whatever the Reapers had in store. The first thing Daniel noticed when he entered the warehouse was the stench, a pungent mix of sweat, motor oil, and the unmistakable scent of danger. His nostrils flared as he instinctively tightened his grip on the gun in his hand. The walls seemed to pulse with the harsh bass of music blaring from unseen speakers, and the air was thick with tension. His ears buzzed with the sound of men shouting, laughing, the kind of noise that filled the space between chaos and violence. "Stay sharp," Daniel whispered to Shadow, his voice low and steady, a practiced calm that masked the storm rising inside him. With a barely audible command, Shadow slipped into the darkness ahead, his paws silent on the cold cement floor, a blur of motion. The dog was a professional, every step measured and deliberate. He could smell fear, detect the faintest rustle of clothing, or the slight shift of a man's weight. They had been through hell together, Daniel and Shadow, and their bond, their chemistry, was unmatched. They could communicate without speaking, anticipate each other's next move with a level of precision that only years of partnership could forge. Inside the warehouse it was pure chaos. The bikers were everywhere, pacing around a large table stacked with stolen electronics, flat-screen TVs, laptops, phones, a treasure trove of ill-gotten goods. Their laughter was sharp and cruel, like the sound of broken glass, bouncing off the walls. Daniel crouched behind a stack of crates, trying to steady his breathing, waiting for the right moment. His heart beat in time with the drumming of the bass, each thump louder than the last. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations, each biker a threat, each movement a potential danger. Then a low, rumbling growl echoed from the shadows ahead. Shadow had found something. Daniel's pulse quickened, every muscle tensing. The dog's instincts were sharp, sharper than anything Daniel had ever known. Shadow had an uncanny ability to sense danger before it arrived, but even so, Daniel couldn't help but feel a knot of unease twist in his stomach. The plan was simple, sweep and clear. Secure the perimeter. The backup was on the way. But when it came to the Reapers, nothing was ever simple. These men were ruthless, unpredictable. The chaos was always just beneath the surface. "Go," Daniel muttered, his voice barely a breath. With a swift movement, Shadow darted across the room, silent as a shadow, vanishing into the maze of crates and broken furniture. He circled the group of bikers, moving with an elegance that only a K9 could possess. Quick, deliberate, always one step ahead. His dark eyes scanned the room, catching every detail, every subtle shift. The dog was in his element. Daniel waited, watching the room with hawk-like focus, waiting for the moment when the bikers would make a mistake. But then, something changed. Reaper, a hulking man with tattoos covering his arms and a jagged scar across his face, turned abruptly. His eyes locked onto Shadow. A slow, dangerous smile stretched across his face as he stepped forward, his heavy boots clanging against the floor. "Get the dog," Reaper shouted, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. Without hesitation, Reaper grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the ground and swung it in a wide arc, aiming directly at Shadow. The sound of metal slicing through the air was followed by a sickening thud as the pipe collided with the side of Shadow's body. The force of the blow sent the dog stumbling backward, a strangled yelp escaping his throat. The pain was immediate, sharp, but even as the dog crumpled to the ground, Daniel knew one thing. This was far from over. "No!" Daniel screamed, his voice raw with terror and rage. His body moved on instinct. His legs pumped hard against the concrete floor as he charged forward, the gun in his hand an extension of his will. His heart hammered in his chest, and his vision blurred with adrenaline. But before he could reach his partner, Reaper swung the pipe again, this time with full force. The blow struck Shadow's back, sending the dog's body into a lifeless heap on the floor. Daniel's world stopped. Shadow lay still, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, the faint rise and fall of his chest barely noticeable. It was too late. Daniel dropped to his knees beside the dog, his fingers trembling as he checked for a pulse. His breath hitched in his throat, but the silence in the warehouse told him everything he needed to know. Shadow wasn't moving. His partner, his friend, the one thing that had kept him going for the last 5 years, the one thing that had saved his life more times than he could count, was now lying in a pool of blood. Reaper's laughter echoed through the warehouse. You should have kept that mutt on a leash. Daniel's eyes burned with a fury he had never known, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The men around him laughed and jeered, unaware that this would be the last moment of their lives as they knew it. Because if there was one thing Daniel Ross knew for certain, it was this. He wasn't just going to arrest them. He was going to make them pay. Daniel's hands shook as he checked his partner's pulse. Shadow was alive barely. His breathing was shallow, ragged. But the damage was devastating. His right leg hung at an unnatural angle. Blood stained his fur. "Stay with me, boy," Daniel whispered, tears welling in his eyes. With one hand clutching Shadow's harness, Daniel pulled him into his arms, knowing they didn't have much time. The bikers, however, didn't seem to care. They were busy laughing, mocking the fallen dog. "Looks like the mutt's out of commission," Reaper taunted, wiping blood from his hands. "Too bad." Daniel's rage surged. This wasn't just an attack on a dog. This was an attack on his family. His brother. Without warning, he pulled his gun free and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "Get out," he snarled. The bikers hesitated, their eyes narrowing. Reaper wasn't afraid of a cop. But the look in Daniel's eyes stopped him. "Make me," Reaper growled. Daniel didn't need words. In a blur, he charged forward, tackling Reaper to the ground. A flurry of fists, kicks, and violence ensued. Daniel had trained for this, he knew how to fight, how to take down the strongest men. But there was something primal in him now. The need to protect. To avenge. The bikers tried to retaliate, but Daniel's fury was unstoppable. Within moments they were on the ground, groaning in pain. But Reaper wasn't done. He reached for his knife. "Not today," Daniel hissed, grabbing Reaper's wrist and snapping it back. He could hear the sirens now, but he didn't stop. He wouldn't stop until every single one of them knew what it meant to hurt his family. When backup arrived, the warehouse was a scene of destruction. Scattered bikers groaning on the floor, their blood staining the concrete, some too dazed to even move. The flashing blue lights from the squad cars illuminated the chaos, casting long shadows across the dimly lit space. Officers moved in, cuffing the men who had once roamed the streets like kings, now brought low by one man's fury. But none of that mattered to Daniel. None of it mattered to Shadow. His heart was still pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. Shadow had been the only thing keeping him from falling apart after losing his wife. The dog had been his anchor, his light in a world that had grown cold and dark. And now Shadow was the one who needed saving. With his knees barely holding him up, Daniel moved to his partner, his hands trembling as he gently scooped the injured dog into his arms. Shadow was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Blood matted his fur, and his right leg hung at a grotesque angle. The sight of it made Daniel's chest tighten, the weight of the situation settling in like a vice. But he wouldn't, give up on him. "I've got you, boy," Daniel murmured, his voice rough with emotion as he carried Shadow to the squad car, cradling him as best he could, careful not to jostle him too much. The rain that had been falling earlier had stopped, but the air was thick with the weight of unspoken words. As they sped toward the vet, Daniel's mind raced, praying that somehow, some miracle would pull Shadow through. The drive to the animal hospital felt like an eternity. Every second stretched out, each minute an unbearable test of patience. By the time they arrived, Shadow was barely more than a limp weight in Daniel's arms, his breaths coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The moment they reached the door, the staff rushed them in. The vet was already waiting. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed in the sterile, cold space, but to Daniel, the world outside might as well have been a dream. His gaze never left Shadow's face as the staff quickly assessed the situation, whisking his dog into the emergency room. Daniel could barely bring himself to sit in the waiting area. His hands were still trembling, his stomach twisted in knots. He could feel the pull of panic clawing at him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to. As the minutes dragged on, Daniel tried to breathe, tried to keep himself composed. But it was impossible not to think of all the time Shadow had been there for him, how the dog had stood by his side during every dangerous situation, every heartbreak, every sleepless night. He couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after everything. Hours passed. Daniel's head dropped into his hands and he closed his eyes, his mind whirling with thoughts of what might happen. He couldn't let go. He wouldn't. Finally the vet emerged. His expression was grave, his lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel didn't need to hear the words. He could already see the sorrow in the vet's eyes. His heart sank and the air in the room seemed to leave him in one rush. "I'm sorry, officer," the vet said softly, sitting down across from Daniel. "Shadow's injuries are severe. His leg is fractured beyond repair, and he's lost a lot of blood. There's internal damage. But he's a fighter. He's made it through surgery. He'll survive." The relief that washed over Daniel was instant, but it was tempered by the vet's next words. "He'll never walk again, officer. The damage to his leg is too severe. He'll need extensive rehabilitation, and even then, there's no guarantee he'll regain full mobility." Daniel nodded slowly, the words sinking in like stones in his chest. Shadow would never run alongside him again, never chase after a suspect with the same strength and speed. But Daniel didn't care about that. His dog was alive. His partner was alive. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice raw as he wiped his eyes, trying to hold himself together. The vet nodded, speaking about possible recovery options. Prosthetics, physical therapy, and what life might look like for Shadow now. But Daniel barely heard him. His mind was already made up. No matter what the future held, no matter how difficult the road to recovery would be, he wasn't going to give up on Shadow. "I'll take care of him," Daniel said firmly, his voice steady now. "Whatever it takes." The vet gave him a soft smile as if he understood exactly what Daniel was saying, what Shadow meant to him. He stood and left, but Daniel remained seated in the sterile room, staring at the door through which Shadow had been taken. The thought of what would come next, the uncertainty of it all, still gnawed at him. But there was one thing he knew for sure: Shadow would have a home. He would have a place beside him just like always. Because family didn't walk away. No matter how long it took, they would be together. Weeks passed, each one bringing a small but steady improvement in Shadow's condition. The days had become slower, quieter. The frantic rush of patrols, the adrenaline of the chase, the danger that had once been a constant companion in their lives, all of that had faded. But even in the absence of action, there was something more enduring. Something far more meaningful. Shadow could never run like he used to, not with the same speed or strength. His right leg, though healed, would never allow him to chase down a suspect or leap with the same ease. It would always be a reminder of what they'd been through, a scar that couldn't be erased. But Shadow was still there, by Daniel's side, just like he'd always been. In the evenings, when the world outside quieted and the weight of the day had settled into the silence of the house, Daniel would sit beside him. He would scratch behind Shadow's ears, his fingers running through the thick, coarse fur, feeling the warmth of the dog's body against his own. And in those moments there were no words, just the shared understanding that they had both survived. That they had made it through hell together. The house had felt empty after the attack, the hum of the outside world fading away as the night crept in. But in the stillness of those nights, Daniel found a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. There was no thrill of the mission, no rush of danger to ignite the air around him. But there was something better, a deep, quiet contentment that came from knowing he wasn't alone anymore. Shadow had been through hell. The pain in his leg, the bruises and scars that lined his body, they would never completely fade. But he had endured. He had survived. And just like Daniel, Shadow had learned to live with the aftermath of battle. And through it all, the loyalty remained. The unspoken bond. The trust. One evening, as the two of them sat in the living room, watching the last of the sun slip beneath the horizon, casting a warm amber glow across the room, Daniel leaned down and whispered to his partner. "They didn't break you, buddy," Daniel said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "And they sure as hell didn't break me." Shadow's tail thumped weakly against the floor, the sound soft but full of meaning. It was as if the dog was telling him without words that he understood. That they were still in this together. That nothing could tear them apart. Daniel smiled, brushing his hand over Shadow's head one more time, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the dog's presence. They didn't need words. They never had. Their bond was stronger than that. It was a silent promise, a promise forged in the fires of struggle, of pain, of loyalty. Family didn't need anything but loyalty. And the silent understanding that, no matter what happened, they would always protect each other. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. The bond between Daniel and Shadow was unbreakable, stronger than any injury, any trauma. It was something that no attack, no matter how vicious, could ever destroy. And in that moment, with the fading light of the day slipping into night, they were whole again. No matter what happened next, no matter where the road took them, Daniel knew one thing for sure: Shadow would always be there. By his side. As family. Forever.